God's plan for our giving is more about our heart than the amount. Today, Pastor Leming continues teaching us about a generous life.
The Gospel of Mark, chapter 12, we're going to read beginning in verse 41 down to verse 44 here in just a few moments. We are talking about a generous life. This is our third message in this series, and there's one more yet to come. But I hope that you've been challenged to live out a generous life. It's not just about our money. It's about the way we carry ourselves, the way we care about others, the way we show compassion, the way we look around us to see others that we might lift up and that we might help. But today we're going to talk about a generous life. We're going to be talking about our money. And then next week we're going to talk about our money in a completely different way. Some of you will have never heard it before. Some of you have heard it, but many of you will have never heard it before. I hope you'll be here. And then when we come to the following month, we'll be changing directions. But let's bow our heads together. Let's ask the Lord to speak to our hearts. Father, I want to live a generous life. I don't want it to be all about me. I don't want to be amassing a reservoir that is beyond what is needed. Lord, I want to be a channel of the things that you have that goes out to others, to bless others. And Father, I pray that all of us would seek to live that way. There is a hurting world all around us, and we're not going to be able to minister to that world if we're not a generous person, if we don't have a generous life. And so, Lord Jesus, cause us to come alive with generosity. Cause us to recognize the needs that are around us. And cause us to love people, to have compassion on them, and to share concern with them. Now speak to our hearts this morning as we look at a story that maybe many of us know, but Lord, I pray that we'll see it in a fresh light, in a new way, as we think about a generous life. In your name I pray. Amen. I want to read to you in Mark chapter 12, beginning in verse 41 down to verse 44. It says, "Now Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw how the people put money into the treasury. And many who were rich put in much. Then one poor widow came and threw in 2 mites, which make a quadrans. So she called his disciples to himself and said to them, 'Assuredly I say to you that this poor widow has put in more than all those who have given to the treasury. For they all put in out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had, her whole livelihood.'" I was thinking about this story today and where it is set, where it's placed in this particular context. And it made me think of a scene that you may have seen at one time or another, maybe in a picture, maybe you've literally witnessed it, of a desert. And out in that desert, it's dry and it's barren. The ground is cracked. The sun is baking the ground. It's causing all kinds of difficulty just because of the immensity of the heat that you're experiencing, the heat that you're feeling. And as far as your eye can see, it's just like that. It's brown, barren, dry, everywhere. But you notice at some point, maybe as you're walking across that brown, barren ground, that cracked ground that's been heated such by the sun, you notice growing up through a little crack, there's this really beautiful little flower. You can't even figure out how this flower is even able to sustain itself. You can't figure out where does this seed for this flower even come from in such a barren situation like this. And yet there it is, as beautiful as any of the other of the flowers that God has created. There it is growing, and it's the only color that you see in the midst of all of the barrenness and all of the brownness, all the sand and all the dirt that's been baked by the sun. There it is, and you can't help but notice it because it's beautiful to see. That very much is the story that I'm looking at with you today. Jesus is in a land of barrenness, spiritual barrenness. Everywhere he looks and everywhere he goes, he sees that barrenness, that emptiness, that dryness. Oh, they're religious, but they're just going through the motions of their religiosity. There is no depth of meaning and no depth of purpose in their relationship with God. It's just a barren desert. And then Jesus comes in our text today, and he introduces us to a little lady who's a little flower. Nobody would notice it except that he points it out. A little beautiful flower that's growing up out of that barren desert that's all around him. And she becomes and is immortalized for all time in the Scripture as an example of what it means to have a generous life. A little lady who has made her way to the temple. She has nothing to her name. She has nothing to her name. As a matter of fact, it seems apparent to me that it's possible, at least, and it's apparent to me that the reason she is in this condition as being called here a poor widow and yet a beautiful flower in the midst of all of this barrenness is because of exactly what goes before in talking about the scribes in verse 40 of chapter 12. Talking about how the scribes conducted themselves. It says about them that they devour widows' houses. They built them out of whatever they had, even the property that they had. The scribes, these are the lawyers of the day. These are the interpreters of the law of that day. These are the ones you would come to and say, I've got a piece of property. And I want you to help me to be able to secure it. But rather than help her to secure it, they would steal it from her. They were devouring widows' houses. These religious men were devouring widows' houses. Can you imagine? That barrenness in that desert that is everywhere and that's completely around us. And it's very likely that this poor widow was poor exactly because some of the scribes had done to her what they had done to so many others in the course of dealing with the widows. And yet she walks into the temple that day. She makes her way into the courtyard of the women. She finds herself moving over toward those giving receptacles. It doesn't tell us which one she was giving to, but she goes over toward one of the giving receptacles and she takes 2 little mites. I didn't say mice. That will scare some of you to leave. She takes 2 little mites and she puts them in the offering. What a contrast to what everybody else is doing on this day in this temple area of utter barrenness and brokenness and dryness. There is this beautiful flower in this poor widow who comes with 2 mites. 2 mites made up 1/64th of a day's wage. 1 mite would make up 128th of a day's wage. She has 2 mites, 1/64th of a day's wage. And she comes and she brings. It says that it's all that she has. She has nothing else. Apparently she has no sons because in that culture, sons would have come and taken care of their mother. They would have made sure that she was provided for. And it seems, as I've already said, that the scribes may have well been some of those guilty of taking from this woman anything else that her husband may have left her. And now all she has to her name are these 2 little mites. I have a picture of a mite. I own the one on the left. That's a quarter there on your right. You can see how small it is. This particular mite, it says in the paperwork that came with it that it was minted somewhere between 100 BC and 1 AD, 1 AD, somewhere in that period. You can hardly see it. If I had it here in my hand, I thought about bringing it. It comes in a little package. I thought about bringing it with me, but the fact of the matter is if I had brought it with me, you wouldn't be able to see it. It would go on, it's like an eraser on a number 2 pencil, about that size in diameter. The bulk of that mite. You could sit it on your thumb and easily hold it there, no problem at all. As a matter of fact, today, as you leave, I'm going to give you a facsimile, a replica of that widow's mite. It's smaller than a penny. It's smaller than a dime. It's hardly worth anything. They say that if you had taken those 2 mites, you might have been able to buy a handful, not a sackful, not a bagful, a handful of flour. That's about all, a handful. Whatever you could pour into a hand and hold in your hand, that's about the amount that 1 mite would buy. And that's all that she has, are these 2 mites to her name. And she brings these 2 mites and she casts them into the offering. And she gives them to God. And Jesus does what I was trying to do earlier. He looks at her and he says to his disciples, get here, come on over here. Get over here where you can watch. She's dressed in the widow's garb. That's how he knows she's a widow. She's dressed in the widow's garb. She makes her way into the court of the women. She moves over toward one of those receptacles and she drops in those 2 mites. You wouldn't even hear them hit. You wouldn't even know they were placed inside. And Jesus says, that's the most beautiful flower you've ever seen. In all of this sea of barrenness, all this religiosity, all of this ceremony, all of the sacrifices, all of the selling and buying they've been doing out here in order to purchase the animals that are needed for the sacrificial system, all of that is just barrenness. It's emptiness. It doesn't have any heart to it. There's no life in it. But you see that little lady? In the midst of all of that barrenness, she is a beautiful flower. I don't know how it grows up like this. I don't know where it all comes from. We don't know where she came from. We don't know when her husband died. We don't know where she got the 2 mites that she had. We don't know where she leaves, where she goes when she leaves. We don't know anything about her death. But on that day, she was a beautiful flower that Jesus immortalizes in the biblical text that we're still reading 2,000 years later. Don't you think that we ought to learn some lessons about a generous life from a lady like that? Don't you think she has something to teach us about living a generous life, especially as it relates to our resources? Don't you think we can learn something from a lady like that? And if Jesus points her out as an example to be immortalized and remembered, don't you think that we can learn from that poor widow? Certainly we can. And there's a few things that I want you to take into account with me. When it comes to our giving, like this woman was giving on this day, our giving should be guided by love, not logic. What was logical about this woman's gift? Absolutely nothing. Had she sat down with a reputable accountant or a CPA, he'd have looked at her and said, ma'am, you need to hold on to that. That's the last that you have. You don't want to give it away. There is no logic in you placing that in the offering. Besides, what are your 2 mites going to mean to such a great and vast temple and all that goes on around the temple? What will 2 mites make a difference? How will 2 mites even make a difference? They would have logically argued with her throughout the course of trying to talk her out of giving those 2 mites. It makes no logic whatsoever. But this woman came on that day. She didn't come to give out of logic. She came to give. She came to give out of the love of her heart for her God. She had come to give because she wanted to give something to the God who loved her and cared for her and watched after her. You say, well, how could God care for her? Look at her circumstances. She believed that God would take care of her. And her giving that day was guided by love and not logic. Do you realize a similar story takes place a little bit later in Mark chapter 14? This again is during the week of Passion Week, the week of the Passover. And you remember Jesus leaves Jerusalem, and there's a woman who comes to Jesus, and she takes a very expensive alabaster that's filled with oil, very expensive oil. Actually, it says it's worth an entire year's wages. Whether this was something that was given to her and handed down to her, or whether this was something that she had saved for and she had purchased for herself, this was something of extreme value. And she takes it and she breaks it. Where's the logic in that? As a matter of fact, there were those that were standing there that day who were angry that she broke the alabaster box. What's the meaning of this? Why would you do that? It's of no value. If it's broken and it's poured out, it's of no value. Why did you do that? And yet she comes in and she breaks the alabaster and she begins to pour the ointment out on Jesus. And Jesus points her out as being someone who loves him. You see, our giving is not to be guided by logic, it's to be guided by love. Secondly, our giving should be guided by faith and not fanfare. This little lady comes into Jerusalem and she comes into the court of the women, and she just sort of passes by everybody and nobody's paying her any attention, unlike those that were rich. They went over to these receptacles. They were shaped like a horn bell, like a ram's horn. We don't know if they were metal or they were a ram's horn, but they're shaped like a ram's horn, so you could pour it in. It would go into a narrow neck, and then it would filter down into a chest where it would be kept until the priest would come and they would receive it. And the rich people were coming in and they were going over to these receptacles and they were putting in their money. Now, if it was made of metal, you might have been able to hear the money. You could have heard it as it rattled all the way down into the chest. And that may be the way that they were showing off. Or it may be that if it's a ram's horn that's being used and it's not as loud or boisterous, it may be that they just had to stand there a long time. I mean, I got to reach in again and put some more in. I'm sorry, I know y'all are waiting in line, but this is important. And reach in and bring some more. I got it. We got a long line back there. Could y'all just be patient a minute and reach in and put some more in? But whether it was because of the noise that was made or whether it was because of the length of time that they were standing there in order to give their offerings, they were trying to make a fanfare. They were having a band play. Y'all pay attention to me. Everybody look at me. I'm so generous. I'm so generous. Everybody look how generous I am. Barrenness, emptiness, dryness. The heat of the sun is bearing down. Jesus didn't point out the rich people. Jesus points out a little flower in a poor widow who has 2 mites. The most she could possibly buy is enough for some flour for one hand, in one hand to carry it away. And Jesus says, I want to tell you something. That's generosity. Because for her, it was love, not logic. For her, it was faith, not fanfare. What is this woman doing on this day? She is casting her entire life on the Lord. She's saying, God, you're the one who's going to have to take care of me. I don't have sons to take care of me. The scribes have taken advantage of me, and my only hope is in you, God. And she reaches out and she gives that gift. It's quiet. You don't even hear it as it hits the receptacle. You don't even notice it. She doesn't take any time. As a matter of fact, it says she threw it in. It's almost as if she was afraid it would get stuck going down. It wouldn't even make it all the way down to the chest. It would make no noise. Those widow's mites are so tiny and so small, you would never have heard anything as it was thrown into those receptacles headed to the box where it was gathered. And yet this woman wasn't there to give out of fanfare. She was there to give out of faith. And she was saying, God, I trust you. A generous life is a life that's characterized by giving in love, and a life that's characterized by giving in faith. Lord, it might not make logic for me to be able to give like I give, and it might seem so insignificant. I mean, I can't make a big fanfare like somebody that can show up with a big check. But you're not giving for fanfare. you're giving out of faith. Our giving should be guided by obedience, not outcome. Think about where she's giving. She's giving to the temple. Do you realize that the temple is filled with corruption? The priests are filled with corruption. The chief priest is filled with corruption. He's going to agree with the crucifixion of Jesus here in just a couple of more days. He's filled with corruption, and Jesus knows that the entire temple is filled with corruption. And he says, before he's crucified, he says, this temple is going to be knocked down, and there won't be one rock standing on another. He knows it's filled with this kind of corruption, and yet this woman wasn't as concerned with the outcome and how her 2 mites might be used as she was obedience, knowing that God had commanded the people to give. God had commanded them to come and to bring their offerings. And here is a woman who comes out of obedience, not because she knows how significant her gift is and what difference it will make, or she knows that it's going to be used by good people. I have a friend who will remind me every so often, and he does so beautifully. He'll say, once I've given to the Lord, it's no longer my responsibility. It's the responsibility of those that are charged with the stewardship of that to use it properly. That's the attitude of this woman. It was not a matter of outcome. It was a matter of obedience. Our giving, fourthly, should be guided by sacrifice, not significance. Sacrifice, not significance. This little mite's called a lepton. It's a Greek word for lepton. 2 of them are lepta. This little mite is not significant at all. But it's not about giving a gift that is significant. Some people can give large gifts. I'm talking about monetarily speaking. They can give large gifts, but they have a lot left over when they finish giving. And other people are like this little widow that when she finishes giving, she has nothing left. She's given everything she has. Because it's not the size of the gift that God notices, but the sacrifice you make in order to give it. The measure of a gift is according to how much you keep, not how much you give. Oh, my goodness, that changes everything, doesn't it? If you got $1 million and you give $100,000, well, you still got a pretty good chunk to take care of yourself. But if you got $1,000 and you give $100, you don't have nearly as much to take care of yourself. You understand what I'm saying? It's not a matter of significance. It's a matter of sacrifice. Some people can make bigger sacrifices than others. Some people can give more significant gifts as it relates to measuring them by themselves, but God doesn't measure gifts against your gifts against mine or mine against yours. God doesn't measure them that way. God measures by the amount of sacrifice. What do you have left over in your pocket after you've given your gift? And then fifthly, our giving should be guided by attitude, not amount. Do you notice what Jesus says about this little lady as she comes in verse 41? Now, Jesus sat opposite the treasury and saw, what's the next word? How the people put their money into the treasury. How the people put the money in the treasury. How did the rich people come? They came blowing their own trumpet. They came announcing what they were doing. They came to be recognized for the gifts that they were making, right? This little lady makes her way into the court of the women and over to one of the receptacles to give 2 mites that you couldn't have even heard. If they were metal bells that led to these cases, you couldn't have even heard those 2 mites as they hit the metal, let alone if they were ram's horns. And it wouldn't have taken her any time. She could have walked by, thrown them in, and walked right on past, and nobody would have even known that she had put something in the offering. But you know what? On that day, she came with the attitude of humility. She came with the attitude of generosity. Because Jesus pays careful attention to our attitudes in giving and not just the absolute dollar amount. Jesus watches And Jesus sees the attitude in which we give what we give. She gave gratefully, and she gave sincerely, and she gave everything that she had. What's revealed by this story is that the monetary capital that a person has to give isn't as important as the moral condition of his heart when he gives it. Are you giving it cheerfully? Are you giving it with love in your heart? Or are you doing what Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians chapter 9? Are you giving it grudgingly? You know, I got to pry your fingers off of this gift. I got to pry your hand open in order to get you to give this gift. Or is it like this woman who walks in, doesn't want to be noticed by anybody, isn't noticed by anybody but Jesus? She's the only flower in the midst of a barren desert of religiosity and ceremonialism. She walks into the middle of all of that crowd where it's dry and dark, where it's hot. Everybody's looking on Jesus and looking for an opportunity to bring the heat onto Jesus. She walks into the midst of it, and she's the only flower there that day. She's a beautiful flower springing up out of that barrenness because her attitude is the attitude of humility and her attitude of gratefulness and the attitude of love for Jesus. And she doesn't give grudgingly. I don't know, if I only had 2 mites, which I do today, if I only had 2 mites to bring, you might have had to work my hand open to get one of them out of my hand. This woman came and she didn't have to be worked to open her hand. She gave both of those mites to her God. I mean, what better lesson on a life of generosity than this little widow?
Thanks for joining us today, and we hope that this message has made a difference for you. If you'd like more information about today's message or about Lewis Memorial Baptist Church, please feel free to contact us. We'd love to hear how this ministry is helping you in your daily walk.